They say Muhammad Ali kept his trophies in gold display cases, but what few knew was that his true treasures were hidden in an old wooden box, locked in the back of his room. Inside were no medals or belts, there were souvenirs, letters, simple objects, and secrets that revealed the man behind the myth. Before he became the greatest, Muhammad Ali was simply Cassius, a curious, restless boy who dreamed of being heard in a world that insisted on silencing him. Decades later, when his voice was already echoing across the globe, he maintained an almost childlike ritual, opening with trembling hands and a serene gaze. A small wooden box kept in the most discreet corner of his home. Inside were memories never revealed in interviews, fragments of a life he himself was trying to understand. They weren't memories of glory, but of humanity. There he collected objects that, to anyone else, would have been worthless: a faded photo of his mother smiling in the kitchen, a torn ticket from a fight he nearly withdrew from, a dove feather he said represented freedom, and a white ribbon handwritten with the name Cassius. Each item held a story, a lesson, a pain. That box was not a reliquary of victories, but a shelter of vulnerabilities. It was where the champion let the warrior rest, and the simple man breathe, while the world watched him with raised fists, defying governments, religions, and armies. Ali retreated into this intimate silence, a space where he didn't need to be invincible. Amidst his fame, he knew that one day, it would all disappear. The crowds, the applause, even the voice Parkinson was beginning to steal from him. And that's why he treasured memories, not to remember what he'd achieved, but to never forget who he was. In this story, we'll open that box. Object by object, we'll discover what truly kept Muhammad Ali standing when the world tried to knock him down. Because, in the end, it wasn't the belts that kept him standing, it was the memories that made him human. It was a muggy afternoon in Louisville, and young Cassius Clay was riding his bike home from school when he discovered someone had stolen his red bike, the only possession he truly owned. He stormed into the police gym, vowing that when he found the thief, he would make him pay dearly. A police officer laughed, looked at the skinny boy with his intense eyes and trembling fists, and said, "Before you fight anyone, kid, you should learn to fight properly." It was there, in that simple, almost comical moment, that Muhammad Ali's destiny began. He accepted the challenge, and the officer introduced him to Joe Martin, a local boxing trainer who saw something different in his eyes, a mixture of rage and faith. Years later, now an Olympic champion, Ali stumbled upon the old gymnasium brochure. The paper was yellowed and folded in half, but that small piece of the past brought tears to his eyes. He held it for minutes, silently, as if standing before a mirror of time. He placed the brochure in his memory box, wrapped in a white handkerchief, and whispered, "Here it all began, here my fire began." That brochure would be the first of his treasures. It was worthless, but it carried the symbolic weight of a promise, never again to be small, never again to be ignored. Each time he opened it, Ali was transported back to that stuffy gym, where the smell of sweat mingled with the sound of gloves hitting sandbags. He remembered the initial fear, the frail body, the looks of those who didn't believe that this boy could become anything. "Train as if your life depended on it," Joe Martin would say, and Cassius trained until his hands bled. When he finally won his first amateur fight, he didn't raise his arms, he just looked to the sky and murmured a prayer. It was the beginning of a silent faith, something that would stay with him until the end. The certainty that God had put him on this path, not to conquer others, but to conquer himself. Inside that wooden box, the aging pamphlet became a symbol of humility. When the world called him arrogant, he looked at that paper and remembered the boy who trembled with fear in the locker room. The boy who prayed before stepping into the ring, who took a beating and bounced back, who believed the impossible could be overcome with discipline and faith. "Never forget where you came from," his mother Odessa would say, and he never forgot. That memory was his antidote to vanity. One night, his body scarred by years and his voice wavering, Ali opened the box again. He took out the pamphlet, ran his fingers over the faded letters, and smiled. He said to his daughter, who watched him silently, "People think my treasure is in my belts, but the real gold is here, because what begins small, when guided by faith, becomes eternal." And it was with this simplicity that the world's greatest fighter kept the first of his secrets. A piece of paper, a silent reminder that strength is born from loss, and that even the most powerful man on the planet began his journey trying to recover a stolen bicycle. Amid the gleaming trophies and golden belts that lined the walls of his home, there was something Muhammad Ali never showed anyone: a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. There were dozens of old envelopes, bearing stamps from various countries and in different handwriting messages from prisoners, soldiers, children, and even mothers who had lost sons in war. Most began the same way. "Dear Ollie, you don't know me, but your words have given me courage." He read them silently, often before bed, and treasured each one as if it were a piece of his own soul. These letters began arriving in the 1960s, when he defied the American government by refusing to fight in the Vietnam War. While the world called him a traitor, some saw him as a symbol of resistance, someone who dared to say no when everyone else was silent. The messages came from people also fighting their own invisible wars: persecuted black men, poor, voiceless, youth, women who saw in Ali's fists a mirror of their own courage. He read them, wept, and responded to some with the same blue pen he kept next to his bundle of letters. He never wanted publicity about it, he said. Faith needed no witnesses. There, he knew those words were more than just thanks. They were pleas for help, cries of desperation from people who believed he could somehow change the world. "If I fall, they fall with me," he repeated softly. And that was why, even when he was banned from fighting, he continued to train in secret, as if each punch in the air were a prayer. The letters kept him alive. They gave meaning to the silence of the days when fame turned to isolation. They were reminders that, despite all the pain, there was still hope and that he was part of it. A 10-year-old girl once wrote, "Mr. Ollie, my father died in the war. You said you wouldn't fight because you had nothing against the Vietnamese. Thank you. Now I know my father didn't die in vain." Ollie held that letter for long minutes, sobbing. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in the center of the box. That paper became a lucky charm. He called it my mirror because, he said, it was the only thing that could remind him of who he truly was, a man, not a myth. Years later, his voice already trembling from the disease, he asked his wife Lonnie to open the box and take out the letters. He read some aloud, even with difficulty, and said, "Those words saved me more than any victory in the ring. When the world called me an enemy, they reminded me that I still had a purpose." These letters weren't just memories. They were the fuel of his faith, the reflection of a man who transformed collective pain into spiritual strength. He guarded them there like someone protecting a fragile flame from the wind, and it was this flame that kept him standing when everyone expected him to fall. And that's why, until his last day, he said that true champions aren't those who win fights, but those who choose to keep believing, even when the whole world doubts them. Courage is not the sound of applause. It is the silence of the letters you read when no one is looking. If this story has touched you so far, if you also believe that strength comes from within and not from victories, leave a like and subscribe, because there's still so much inside this box, and each memory of Muhammad Ali reveals a new touch of humanity, a new round of the soul. And to help us continue uncovering these real stories and improving the quality of our content, consider purchasing our ebook. You'll find the direct link in the first link in the description. Your support makes all the difference. Among all the objects stored in that box, there was one Ollie never let anyone touch, a hand-embroidered white handkerchief with the name Odessa stitched in blue thread. It was his mother's handkerchief. He carried it with him on almost every trip, carefully folded, like an amulet. The handkerchief had no scent, no shine, no material value, but it carried the weight of the presence that shaped the champion's heart. When the gym lights dimmed and the crowd's screams died down, it was the memory of his mother that made him feel human again. Odessa Clay was the first person to believe Cassius had something special. As a boy, she called him my sunshine, saying there was light in his eyes even when the world tried to extinguish it. She taught him to pray, to give thanks before fights, and to never return hate with hate. When Ollie won his first Olympic medal, he had it wrapped and brought it straight to her. He told her the gold wasn't his, it was hers. She smiled, hugged him tightly, and cried. That was the day he promised. "One day, Mum, I'll be the greatest, but I'll also be the most righteous." The handkerchief arrived years later, at a time when his faith was being tested. It was 1967, and Ollie was on trial for refusing to fight in the Vietnam War. He had lost everything: his title, his money, his right to fight. The world saw him as a traitor, and many abandoned him, but a letter arrived written in the same handwriting that had rocked him as a child. It was from Odessa. Inside the envelope was only the handkerchief and a simple sentence: "Son, keep your soul clean, even if the world calls you dirty." He wept silently and folded the handkerchief like a prayer. During those dark years, the handkerchief accompanied him everywhere. When he trained alone, sweating and panting, he would leave it on the table as a reminder that there was still purity amidst the pain. When the press taunted him, calling him a coward, he would touch the cloth in his pocket and take a deep breath. My mother taught me that the one who shouts the loudest isn't the one who wins. He would say. The handkerchief was his spiritual anchor, a symbol of dignity at a time when society treated him as an enemy. One night, after an interview in which he was humiliated live on TV, Ollie returned to his room and remained silent for hours. He took his handkerchief, wiped it across his face, and looked in the mirror. They took my belt, but they can't take what you gave me, mother. The words came out softly, almost a whisper, but full of power. He knew that, even amidst injustice, there was something inside him that no one could break. His mother's legacy, the faith that doesn't bend, the love that doesn't compromise. Years later, when the disease was already robbing him of control over his hands, Ollie would still ask Lonnie to place the handkerchief on his desk. He would stare at it, motionless, his eyes welling up, as if each thread of the fabric were a direct link to God. This handkerchief reminds me where my strength comes from, not from muscles, but from love. And love never fades. The Odessa scarf wasn't just a memento, it was the symbol of Muhammad Ali's heart, and whenever the world doubted him, all it took was touching that piece of fabric to remind him he was still the same boy from Louisville, the son of a woman who taught him to fight without losing his soul. The force that knocks a man down is physical, the force that lifts him up again comes from love. Carefully stored in a cloth bag, shrouded in almost sacred silence, were the blood-stained gloves, one of the most precious and most painful objects Muhammad Ali kept until the end of his life. They weren't from a famous fight, nor from a glorious moment. They were from a brutal training session, on a sweltering afternoon in 1964, just days before he faced Sonny Liston for the first time. At that time, Ali was still considered an arrogant kid, too loudmouthed to be taken seriously. But that day, something in him changed forever. During training, Ali was hit hard. A hook from one of his sparring partners left him dizzy, his nose began to bleed, and he fell to his knees. Everyone expected him to stop. Joe Martin, his old mentor, shouted, "That's enough for today, Cassius." But Ollie got up slowly, staggering, his face covered in sweat and blood. He looked in the mirror and muttered, "If I go down now, I'll never get up in the ring." Then he fought again. His punches were slow, but there was a contained fury, a fire burning within. At the end of the training session, exhausted, he left his gloves on the floor. Blood was running, dripping, and he stared at those stains as if facing a revelation that it was at that moment that Cassius Clay died and Muhammad Ali was born. In the reflection of the gym mirror, he saw not just a fighter, but a man who understood the price of faith itself. "Now I know what it means to conquer fear," he said softly. That night he washed his face, but didn't clean his gloves. He asked them to be kept exactly as they were, and so he did. Those red stains became a symbol of something greater, pain as part of the journey, sacrifice as the price of greatness. Years later, speaking of that day, Ollie confided to a friend, "It was blood that taught me to be invincible, because pain is the language God uses to test the chosen." He didn't say this with pride, but with serenity. He knew that glory was a momentary stage, but suffering was eternal and shaped the spirit. Each time he opened his box of memories, he touched the gloves carefully. The stains were already dark, the leather worn, but to him, they still pulsed. "These gloves speak," he would say. "They remind me that fear bleeds before it dies." During his years of exile from the ring, when he was banned from fighting for refusing to go to war, Ollie kept his gloves on his desk. Sometimes he would stare at them for hours. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of his slow breathing. He said the gloves reminded him that he had faced enemies far greater than the government, his own fear, his own doubt, his own loneliness. "I defeated myself before I defeated any other man," he would repeat. As illness weakened him, and his hands trembled, the gloves became almost a divine symbol. One day, a journalist asked him why he still wore them. Ollie smiled and replied quietly, "Because I still see my blood there, and as long as I remember what I shed to become who I am, I'm still the same man." This phrase stuck in the minds of those who heard it, like a confession of faith. In his collection of souvenirs, those gloves were the symbol of the most intimate battle, the invisible struggle between body and spirit, between man and myth. The dried blood on them wasn't just pain, it was identity. It was a reminder that true victory doesn't happen in front of the cameras, but in those times when the soul chooses not to give up. Ali used to say, "A champion is not one who never bleeds. It is one who, even when bleeding, continues to believe." And perhaps that is why he kept them until the end, because there, in that stained leather, was the most honest proof of his humanity. In the darkest corner of his room stood a small oval mirror, with a gilded frame and glass slightly tarnished by age. It wasn't expensive, nor decorative, it was a simple mirror, the kind that might go unnoticed in any home. But for Muhammad Ali, the object held profound meaning. It was before it that the champion stripped himself of all his glory, his applause, and his belts, and saw himself simply as a man. Every day before bed, he would approach it, rest his trembling hands on the table, and stare at his reflection, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears in his eyes. This was the final ritual of his life. The mirror had been a gift from his wife Lonnie back in the 1970s. When Ali was beginning to show the first signs of Parkinson's, she said he needed to look at himself every day to remind himself he was still the same man, even when his body betrayed him. At first, he found it too symbolic, even naive. But over time, the mirror became a kind of confidant. Before it, Ali would talk to himself, not the myth, but the boy from Louisville. He spoke in a trembling voice, sometimes barely audible, about everything he had lived, lost and learned. "You're still the same kid, just slower," he would say with a half smile. On sleepless nights, he would open the memory box, take out one object at a time, and place them on the table next to the mirror. The high school brochure, the letters, his mother's handkerchief, the stained gloves, and then he would look at his reflection and murmur, "This is why I lived." To understand that every blow, every pain, every loss, was just God's way of teaching me to love more. At these times, his expression changed. There was no arrogance, no sadness. There was peace. The mirror reflected a man who had already made peace with time. When the interviews ceased and fame faded, the mirror remained his audience. He stared into it, even when the words no longer came. Sometimes he would slowly raise his hand and make the gesture of a light, almost symbolic fist bump. Then he would smile. It was as if to say, "I'm still here." And he was. Even when his body became a prison, his soul continued to dance among memories. He said the reflection didn't show the wrinkles or the tremors. It showed the soul of someone who had survived it all. One morning, Lonnie walked into the room and found him sitting motionless before the mirror, the box open and all the objects scattered about. He looked at her tenderly and, with great effort, pointed to the mirror. He murmured something she could only partially understand. "Everything I am is here." She wept. She knew he wasn't just talking about the reflection, but about everything he had experienced. Each object in that box was a piece of the man behind the champion, the son, the friend, the husband, the believer, the dreamer. That in his later years, the mirror and the box became inseparable. When illness prevented him from speaking, Lonnie would place the mirror in front of him and the objects beside it. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he cried, and even without words, his eyes spoke volumes. There was a silent message there, a testament to faith, because Muhammad Ali never wanted to be remembered solely by his fists. He wanted to be remembered by his heart. And in that mirror, what he saw was no longer the reflection of a fighter. It was the reflection of a man who understood that the real ring had always been life. At his funeral, as thousands gathered to honor him, Lonnie discreetly placed the old box on the coffin. Inside were the same objects: the pamphlet, the letters, the handkerchief, the gloves, and the mirror. She said softly, "Now you can rest, champion. Your treasures go with you." And so, the man who fought the world departed, taking with him his small symbols, fragments of humanity that proved that, before he was the greatest, he was deeply human. Glory dies with time, but what you keep in your heart lives forever. At the end of it all, when the lights go out and the world forgets the applause, what remains are the little things, the silent gestures, the simple objects, the memories that time cannot erase. For Muhammad Ali, this was true victory. Not the victory of belts, nor the victory of crowds, but the victory of the man who learned to overcome pride with humility and fear with faith. Inside that old wooden box was the complete portrait of his soul, the pamphlet that marked the beginning of his journey, the letters that gave him purpose, the scarf that kept him pure, the gloves that taught him the value of pain, and the mirror that made him see his own humanity. Ali understood what many never do, that greatness lies not in what is achieved, but in what is carried within. As the years passed, the illness that silenced him did not defeat him. On the contrary, it gave him a new kind of voice, the voice of example. Every tremor of his hands became a symbol of resistance. Every word spoken with effort took on the weight of a prayer. He who once shouted, "I am the greatest," now spoke with the serenity of the wise. Life is the greatest ring of all, and faith is what keeps you standing when you no longer have the strength to fight. Even when his body gave way, his spirit remained standing, reminding the world that true power lies not in the muscles, but in the soul. The memory box was his way of conversing with God. Silently, he opened it and relived each chapter of his own existence, not to boast, but to give thanks. There, he didn't collect objects. He collected lessons. Each mark, each piece of paper, each stain told a story about how to remain whole amidst chaos. It was his way of telling the world that glory is fleeting, but compassion is eternal. And perhaps that's why his memory still pulsates strongly, even decades after his passing. Because he wasn't just a fighter, he was a mirror for us all. When Lonnie closed the lid of that box for the last time, he wasn't just storing memories. He was closing a life that taught entire generations to rise, even when all seemed lost. And, in a way, every person who admired him, every young person who dreamed of courage, carries a piece of that box inside them today. Muhammad Ali's legacy doesn't fit in the ring, nor in history books. It lives on in the streets, in words, in hands that tremble but still believe. There he departed, but he left the world a different man. He made pain, poetry, faith a shield, and humanity his greatest weapon. His voice still echoes in the minds of those who saw him fight, and in every heart that learned from him the true meaning of victory. Because, in the end, the man the world knew as the greatest of all time wanted only to be remembered as a man of pure soul. And perhaps that is the greatest triumph of all, to have been a giant in body, but immortal in heart. The hands that fight grow old, the trophies rust, the voices fall silent, but the love we leave in the world never dies.